Welcome to this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast, where we're going to dig deep into what drives us and what drains us. Today, we're talking about burnout, not just stress, but the kind of exhaustion that hits even the most ambitious, high-performing people. Why does it happen? What are the warning signs? And most importantly, what can we do about it? Let's unpack the pressure, the ambition, and the interventions that can help us reset for ourselves and for our teams. This is the Truth Be Told podcast, where we unlock the secrets of strategic communication. Today's guest is a true force in the world of mental health, workforce wellness, and leadership development. With over 18 years of experience, Kasey Franco has led high-impact coaching, training, and culture transformation across corporate, government, and academic spaces. She's a visionary leader with a proven track record of designing scalable programs that reduce burnout, boost performance, and align well-being with business goals. Kasey brings deep expertise in organizational learning, inclusive leadership, and emotional intelligence, empowering both people and systems to thrive. Originally from the Bay Area, she holds a bachelor's in criminal justice with a minor in psychology from Northern Arizona University and a master's in forensic psych from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. So excited to talk to Kasey today and try to help you, me, and our teams communicate better with themselves when it comes to burnout. Welcome to this episode of Truth Be Told. I'm your host, Dave Thompson. I am here with Kasey Franco. How are you today, Kasey?
Good, thank you. How are you?
I'm wonderful. I'm excited to talk to you about a few different things. I know we're going to focus on one specific topic, and I know our listeners heard a little bit of your background, but your training and your work kind of blends a few fields of mental health, workforce wellness, leadership development, which is exciting. But it sounds like we're about to have like an hour open therapy session of Dave Thompson today. That's kind of,
Yes, how does that make you feel?
yeah, well, see, that's how it starts. I'm curious, when I was looking at kind of all the different training and consulting you've done, what's really cool to me is that the topics we're going to get into really applies to anybody and everybody. So if you're listening, no matter your profession, or even if you don't have a profession at the current moment, you've done work in the public sector with our friends at Chicago Police. You've done work with big corporate clients, and you've done work in the education and industry and with just kind of community partners. So how have you found that, like, just to be able to translate what we're going to talk about to all these different fields?
Yeah, I mean, when we're thinking about the concept of burnout, it started not in my teaching or working with everybody. It started with me, my own experience with it, and not realizing what was happening to me and why I was experiencing the things I experienced. And so when I went on my own journey to figure out what was happening to me is when I became really interested in the concept of teaching it. And then as I started to sort of get into these different sectors and deal with different people, I realized it was impacting everybody. And little differences, little nuances, but for the most part, the symptomology was the same and everybody was sort of going home struggling with the same things in a way. And so I found it sort of a mission to think about how to, utilize intervention instead of postvention, which is kind of like where we're still at in our society.
Well, what I'm hoping, if you're listening right now and you think you're just a high performer and you're really ambitious, which is great, right? And positive qualities you want in somebody. But what I have seen a lot is that ambition often gets confused with burnout, or might lead to burnout, or one could complement the other. So maybe kind of just kick off with your thoughts on that, on how somebody who might feel like they're just really ambitious and they're given 110%, but that might mean there's some potential saboteurs in their professional development.
That's right. Yeah, ambition is amazing. It's a massive strength. It's the underlying strength to any sort of saboteur, but it's not ambition is not the problem. It's the environment. So high performers are often praised for pushing past limits, which teaches them to override signals of fatigue. So when success becomes tied to self-worth, people ignore burnout until it's too late. And then culture rewards output, not sustainability. So it's not actually ambition, it's the overutilization of output, if that makes sense.
Do you think that is applying as people are listening, trying to relate to themselves in both our personal and our professional lives?
Yeah, so burnout stacks. So you can't, in theory, although this might feel like you can, compartmentalizing burnout isn't really a thing. It can be maybe a short-term solution, but yeah, you can stack burnout, and there's many different types of burnout. There's cognitive burnout, so that's decision fatigue, brain fog, trouble focusing. That's all like prefrontal cortex overload. There's emotional burnout, which is something I think that was one of my first like red flags, and that's numbness, irritability, empathy fatigue, which is really like the amygdala dysregulation or the lower vagal tone. And then you have physical burnout. That's like your chronic fatigue, your immune suppression, sleep disruption. Lastly, which is kind of the biggest one where I think people really, this is sort of like the end of the spectrum, is identity burnouts. This is misalignment with values, role confusion. This is kind of that disconnection from self-efficacy and purpose. And I feel like a lot of people are struggling with that right now in the burnout space.
Yeah, I want to dig into those because I feel like we hear burnout all the time as a catch-all maybe for everything from I'm overwhelmed or I'm tired or I'm overworked or I'm anxious. But when you start to actually look at what burnout is and how you kind of operationalize that, those are, I guess, the four categories that we could actually look into. When you start stacking these types of burnout, is there one that usually starts to make its appearance first that would be the trigger of thinking, okay, I'm listening to this podcast and I kind of do feel that way. Maybe that is what I'm experiencing.
So because everybody's a unique individual, it honestly starts with some self-awareness. So I'll give you sort of the definition of burnout scientifically, and then we can kind of start to go in what that might look like for you as an individual. But scientifically, burnout is the neurophysiological pattern of like prolonged stress that shifts the nervous system into the sympathetic overdrive. So that's kind of fight or flight, although because we have functioned in that way for so long, it doesn't necessarily feel fight or flight. People might not feel in crisis. It's just sort of the overdrive of that constant output. And then what happens is that suppresses the prefrontal cortex, which is clarity, the utilization of decision-making, empathy. And what happens when those two things are dysregulated, it dysregulates sleep, hormones, and mood. So that can then lead to brain body changes in our expectations or daily structures of like what we're engaging in. So burnout can be everywhere, but our systems, they're not designed necessarily with it in mind. So we end up having to think about ourselves in this context a lot, not necessarily how the environment is affecting us, although that's really important, but what those symptoms might look like for us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. When you say prolonged, and I'm sure like everything, there's going to be variables with each person handles things differently, but and putting into context, could prolonged be something where somebody's got an exam coming up, so they're studying hard for 2 weeks, or you've got law enforcement who's on civil unrest and working crazy hours for 2 days, or could it be a job that somebody's been stressed out about for 12 months? Does that
Yeah.
prolonged have some variability to what that looks like?
Yeah, for sure. So if there is, that's tough because an exam in theory, like if there's a relief of the stress, yes, it's not technically burnout. However, most people in school are still like on that grind even after the exam. It's kind of like on to the
Right.
next. So although that's more associated with whether that's anxiety or not, right? So you have all this nervous feeling and you're about to take the test and then you take it and then after you sort of relax, that's different than maybe experiencing long-term anxiety. But when it comes to burnout, it's the constant state of stress. And so it depends. It depends on you. I think most people are living in sort of a constant state of stress because depending on what's going on with their lives. But if you're working, you're a parent, you're in school, you have a lot of different responsibilities and you're kind of staying up all the time and there's not a lot of recovery, most of the time people are finding themselves in some state or spectrum of burnout because even though, the big recovery moments are important, but really burnout needs like micro intervention all the time. So again, at the end of the day, it's really about checking in with yourself and not trying to think necessarily is the environment the problem, but really like what am I experiencing and what can I do to interrupt the different sort of stress responses.
That's good feedback. What are some of the things, if I want to be aware myself, that I or the hypothetical anybody else listening, not just Dave, but anybody should be thinking, hey, this feeling is off, or this might be related to burnout versus just, I'm just overwhelmed. I got a lot on my plate right now. What does that
Yeah.
feel like?
One of my favorite ways to think about this is this concept called the hand on the hot stove concept. This is something I do in my coaching with my coaching clients because it's the easiest way to kind of think about how, like what state you're in. But if you think about physically, okay, you touch a hot stove and you take your hand off right away and you're like, oh my God, that hurts so bad. And then you sort of recover and you realize, well, let's not do that again. But in our life, we don't always do that. We kind of like stay in that space of high stress or the burn. And so it's, to me, like if you can take a moment to think, am I like do I have my hand on this hot stove, or have I experienced this stress or this emotion and then understood what it is, took my hand off and then started to move forward again? Because anytime you're staying in a space of like stress that lasts more than your hand on a hot stove, eventually you're going to put yourself in that burnout stage. Or if your emotional reactivity, right, stays for longer than your hand on the hot stove, that's also a stage that can lead to burnout. Now, with that said, that takes a lot of self-awareness and tension to take your hand off the hot stove. And sometimes we need coaching or tools to make that interruption. But that's a good first start to just think, are these feelings that I'm having causing turmoil or burn? Or am I acting out of, a way of understanding, okay, this isn't helpful to me?
And you mentioned earlier when we first kicked off, a lot of high performers are maybe more vulnerable to burnout. So how do you separate that, right? I mean, a lot of people listening are probably high performers. They're listening to podcasts and continued education because they want to advance in their career, be more self-aware. So how do you balance this? Like, you got to go through a little pain to be successful, but when is the stove too hot that I need to separate myself for a minute?
Yeah, I think that's the myth, is that you had to put a little pain in it. Because when we were kids, what was like no pain, no gain, right?
Right,
Was the
exactly. I was
saying.
picturing the t-shirt. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a bit of a myth because in theory you don't need to be driven by pain. So that's anytime you're driven by negative emotion or pain, you're driven by the saboteurs, which is just an overutilization of survival skills that you learned in childhood, or you're being driven by threats that you see, and that's normal. I mean, biologically, we're run to understand every 3 threats to 1. So we're sort of acting in a survival method anyway. But you don't need to be pushing yourself through pain. So the thing is when you find an understanding that there are interventions to burnout, and you can create gray matter density in your brain through small micro intentional spaces like deep breathing, and we can get into those tools, you actually create space to be run by clarity, the sense of ease and flow, which actually makes you way more effective than being pushed by pain. When you're pushing and not necessarily like in a state of ease and flow, your brain doesn't utilize half of the space it could to really get the job done quicker. So when I work with high performing companies, the training isn't can you find a work-life balance? Although I do like that concept,
Right.
it's more of what does it look like to fit in intention before every single meeting, before every single email, which, creates different parts of your brain to focus on. What does it look like to incorporate a deep breath every time you wash your hands? So you're just anchoring these spaces to have your brain do these micro resets. That actually creates more ambition than taking up all this space of stress and worry.
Yeah, I really like that because I think there's this, and I've had this, there's this fear of I don't want burnout, but I also don't want to fall behind. And there's
Yeah.
an end goal of something positive. If I work hard or if I work X amount of more hours these next weeks, I see a benefit at the end, but when is that too much? And I think I know we'll talk about this, but having some of those intentional interventions can be helpful. So you have a checkpoint along the way. Because what I want to ask you about that is, like, I have a yes problem, and I'm sure a lot of people here have the same. Where if there's somebody who's reliable at their company or in their family or in their relationship, and they get asked to do a project or a stretch project, they're always going to say yes. And sometimes I'm sure that's not the right thing to say, but how can you balance, I guess, always being the reliable person in your situation, but also still protect yourself from burnout at the same time?
Yeah. Modeling boundaries is really important. And I think, like, let me explain boundaries, because I think sometimes people think, well, sometimes I can't say no, or it's not about that. It's just setting realistic expectations within those boundaries. And I was just having this conversation yesterday with one of my coaching clients. When, like, for example, if somebody comes to you and say, hey, we really want to do this, and the expectation is that the turnaround is not 2 weeks, right? Like, they need 2 months for this type of turnaround. How do you model that boundary? Especially leaders, to model that boundary is really important. Of like, yes, I can do this. Two things are true. And I need the proper time in order to get it done in the quality that it needs to be done. When you model that, you give other people the same permission, because the truth is, and I know this is going to be really hard to hear because we live in an urgency culture. Usually the urgency isn't that urgent. And sometimes your urgency is different than my urgency, right? I might come to you and be like, Dave, we got to do this, this, and this. And you might react to my energy and be like, okay, I'm on it. Yes. And then you walk away from that conversation being like, how am I going to do this? I'm so overwhelmed. And then you're in a state of burnout. And I'm like, great, Dave's going to get it done.
Right.
Right? Versus coming to you with that energy and you matching the right energy, which is bringing the tone down, setting, modeling that boundary. And then you get the time you need. You still get to say yes. And everybody around you understands that there are realistic expectations, and a sense of urgency in a culture actually contributes to burnout.
Yeah, I want to explore that more because we talked a little bit earlier about kind of this personal awareness and checkpoints, but you referenced this a few times. It's often the system that you're a part of, and that system could be a relationship or a family dynamic or your professional environment. And since all of our episodes tie into communication, what I kind of want to explore is how, as a leader or as the person maybe feeling the burnout, how we can communicate better to each other to protect that. And what you just said, I think, is really, really important, because as in a leadership role, when somebody can say to me, yep, I can get that project done, but just so you know, it's going to require these 5 things, which is probably going to take me 6 weeks to do. I'm more educated going forward, maybe assigning or managing those projects. So the communication is really important. But I think some people are often afraid to challenge upwards or communicate with transparency. So any advice on that is how saying yes, but qualifying that yes, and doing it in a safe way.
Yeah. Let me tell you my favorite way to do this. And for anybody listening, I suggest you follow along by doing the activity. But this is something I did at a past organization, and I kept it with me through teaching organizations how to communicate, basically, with any population. But when you need to be able to communicate with your team, and we understand that there's a lot of dynamics and saboteurs at play in a room at any given time, right? There's different levels of burnout. There's all sorts of things coming into the middle. You're also coming with a lot of different background, your upbringing, your dynamic. You came from home, your morning routine. Like, think about everybody's bringing in such wildly different energy that communicating actually takes a lot of intention, and you can't guess what the other person is going through, right? So one of my favorite things to do, and I'll tell you how I did this with my team in the past. We all sat down and we had 3 circles. We had green, yellow, and red. And in each circle, we put words down that described what we looked like or how we felt in those different spaces. So in green, what are all the things, all the ways that I would know that I was feeling good, right? That I was feeling happy, that I was energized, which is actually, most people have never asked that question before of like, what do you look like when you feel good? Because we mostly focus on what do you look like when you feel bad.
Right.
And sometimes people don't know. They're like, I think maybe I smile, like I feel maybe a sense of ease. So first we do that so that we understand we're creating our own self-awareness while also our team awareness. So we do green. The yellow is this middle space. It's where most people sort of exist all the time, but we need to understand what that middle is. So what does it look like when you're not feeling your worst and you're not feeling your best, but you're right in the middle? And then you're red. What does it look like when you're feeling your worst? So you get all of those down, and then underneath you do your communication patterns. So how do you communicate when you're in green to your team? And how do you receive communication when you're in your green? And the same with each color. How do you communicate when you're in red? And how do you receive communication when you're in red? And then your last sort of layer is maybe sometimes your coping skills. So what are the things you do that are non-negotiables that are part of your green, right? Like most people every single day, they follow the same routine in the morning. They get up, they have coffee, they brush their teeth. Those are like non-negotiable things that you do to take care of yourself. In red, sometimes people will go for a walk or they'll call their friend or their parent. So kind of understand what the baseline coping skills are in those spaces. So now you've created this whole sort of activity of self-awareness. And then as a team, you start to have a conversation about what it might look like to communicate with you when we're in different color spaces, right? So let me give you an example. If I'm in red, my communication style to you is very aggressive and somewhat combative. That's just where I'm going to be when I'm in red, right? I'm a little bit clouded by stubbornness and judgment, and I'm going to come at you in a more aggressive way. If you are also in red and your communication style is totally avoidant and I'm coming after you, I'm like an attack dog and you're going to be hiding in the corner. That it's not helpful for anybody, right? And so then we can have that conversation of, well, Dave, you when you're in red, your communication is to go silent. Okay, then you and I need to have a conversation about what it looks like when we're both in red and how can we identify that. So each start of our team meetings, once we've done this activity, we'll just quickly kind of go around, or you can put a magnet. We used to have like a whiteboard, you can put a magnet in one of the colors and just understand what is that people need. So if my team then knew I was in red and my coping skill for that was to, have somebody else run the meeting, then that communication and the expectation was established. And so you open this field for a lot more communication and potentially even accountability of like, hey, I'm noticing that you're sweating and avoiding my conversation. Like, how are you doing? And you can then say, yeah, I'm like feeling in the red. And then you and I have made this agreement that when that happens, maybe we don't do our one-to-one right this minute.
Yeah, I love that. When you've done that experiment, does that obviously take some vulnerability from some people? Do you see any struggles with people kind of exploring or sharing those things?
So yes, but I don't use the word vulnerability. And this is what helps. I think the word vulnerability does confuse people sometimes because they do think that means they have to be really emotional. And especially in the workplace, I don't always agree with that. I am definitely guilty of that. I'm not somebody who wants to show my emotions often. And you're not going to catch me crying either. Like I'm one of those people who are just like, will quickly game face. However, the word I really like that I think has resonated with the workforce is just authenticity and not necessarily vulnerability. So how do you establish your authentic self with your team? Where, you're not digging into the feelings, but you're just establishing like, this is where I'm at authentically right now. This is my reactions authentically. How do we then interact and establish the right communication?
Well, and you can tell me if I'm about to be wrong here, but I would imagine if somebody is inauthentic and always worried about trying to put on a different face or present themselves in a different way, that would have to deliver high stress and potential result in burnout versus just being able to be your authentic self.
Yeah, I mean, it's a misalignment in values, which is tough when your internal values aren't matching your external output or your external values. That can be that's the struggle. I think that's where a lot of my coaching clients come from, is this space of feeling sort of misaligned with who they are and how they're presenting in the workplace.
And this is probably going to get muddled with like secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, what I'm about to talk about. But I think about the investigators that are listening, and this could be anybody from a human resource professional to a law enforcement officer, anybody in between. But you're being authentic, but you also might be exposed to these like high stress situations for prolonged periods where maybe you're interviewing somebody after, maybe in the private sector, after an active shooter situation or workplace violence. And so you're being authentic to you, but you're also kind of receiving the secondary trauma from listening to people's stories, and it's high stress. And then law enforcement, same concept. So are you seeing, is there a higher likelihood, I guess, of burnout that's related to this kind of secondary trauma or exposure to traumatic events?
For sure. Yeah, for sure. There's no doubt, because you're being exposed to other people's pain all the time. So I wouldn't say that because there's a higher likelihood of it, then you need to then step up your intervention stages, right? So, you can't, to be fair, you can't compare burnout. Like my burnout to somebody who's exposed to trauma every single day's burnout is going to be different, and nobody's is worse or better, right? It's all bad.
Right.
It's all affecting us individually. We're all sitting with our own pain, or there's long-term health outcomes, and each person has their own experience with that. So it's not that there's worse burnout or better burnout, but those, yes, exposed to trauma or exposed to other people's pains need probably more intervention or more intention about what they're doing during those spaces, right? How they're protecting themselves. Like that's really significant tool building. And then what recovery looks like. And by recovery, I don't mean like a 2-week vacation, right? But there are brain resets that are rooted in science that you can be doing during high exposure and after high exposure and before high exposure that help sort of that brain recover.
Yeah, and I want to get to some of those, like the interventions, obviously, what the takeaways for today. I want to get to some of those and how people can be more. It's one thing to talk about this and then leave a
Yeah.
podcast and think, okay, I have burnout. Great. It's a better thing to think, what can I do? So I want to get to some of those. But what ironically is I'm sitting here talking to you over to the side, I can see my phone is blowing up. And
Yeah.
I start to think about like when I first got into the workforce, I don't think I had the cell phone. We had a pager maybe. The BlackBerry started to come out, and
Yeah.
you still a little bit of separation. And before that, obviously, that didn't exist. But now most people can't get away, whether it's work from email, the phone call, the text message, or the constant news cycle. Like we're always in touch.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that is not helpful for this issue of burnout, but how have you seen technology kind of help or hurt this space?
Yeah, I would say so. On the helpful side, perhaps people know more about burnout, and because, yeah, I think you're right. Before we had a lot of exposure to the internet, I had never heard of burnout when I was going through graduate school, which is probably why I went for years not understanding what was happening to me. I never had even heard of the concept. So I think on one hand, and this is pretty much true with most things when they're talking about the cell phone era at this point, is that on one hand, you get more information, and on the other hand, you get too much information, right? You're in this constant, getting this constant input to your brain. But there are so many little tricks, like you can see your phone. I can't. I put mine behind my computer so that it's not even in my visual, and those are small tricks that you can do for your brain. So even you seeing it is problematic. And they say the same thing with kids in school. Kids who don't even have their phones in the classroom, but they're in their lockers, helps them focus than if their phones are in their vicinity and they can see them, and then they're more focused on them.
Yeah, just a separation. Well, it's interesting because I think about like if people are working, you're sitting in front of a computer, and as soon as you get a break away from your email or whatever you're working on, the first thing you do is you look at another screen, and that's your phone. And
Right.
then you get home for the day, or maybe you're home all day, and then you'd stop working and you turn on a bigger screen and you watch TV, and it's like we're just constantly um, occupying ourselves with the screen and with information versus maybe going for a walk outside. And so the
Yeah.
technology can be pretty overwhelming.
Yeah, it's interrupted like our ability to truly rest. The brain's default network, which helps us sort of restore and reflect, is rarely engaged anymore. And so all of these constant notifications, they hijack dopamine, and then the blue light disrupts circadian rhythms. So we're just overstimulated and under recovered. It doesn't mean, again, it does not mean that like all hope is lost. It's just that sometimes busyness can be socially like a socially rewarded behavior, and it gives us a sense of importance and validation and escape, but also being overwhelmed feels sometimes safer than being still, which is why I like the smaller interventions and not maybe sitting for 30 minutes and doing a meditation and trying to get your brain clear. It's like going into the gym and you haven't been there in months and trying to do 10 pull-ups.
Right.
That's hard, right?
Yeah, that's good. That's a good example. And I think about from a workspace standpoint, how to build a better culture around this. I'd be more aware of it. And one of the things I don't know the right answer to this, which is why I'm talking to you. But one of the things that we struggle with, and a lot of organizations, I'm sure, we've got a really interesting scheduling of our team. Right? We got a lot of people on the road all the time. We got people that are traveling, or they're maybe teaching a class. They're pretty much off their device from normal business hours, which means a lot of email back and forth is happening on a flight at night or early morning before you get to the airport or whatever. And that might not be the most convenient time for somebody else to read an email. And so I used to go through this concept of the delay delivery, right? Get some emails
Yeah.
because maybe Sunday night works best for me, prep those, and then they all go out Monday morning. I ran into some issues with that, right? There's maybe stuff happens in that time frame, then all of a sudden somebody else is bombarded with 30 emails at 8 a.m. So I've changed my pattern to send emails when it's convenient for me, but with a note that says my hours may be different than your hours, so don't feel the need to, respond in kind of this out of normal workday time frame. But any suggestions, I guess, just for people that communicate heavily via tech on how to manage the communication?
Yeah, just setting expectations. Like you just said, you send a note, but when your workforce understands the expectations, you take out the uncertainty for everybody, right? And we saw this in the pandemic. Uncertainty really skyrockets stress and burnout, right? And fear. The same thing as when you're managing a team. As long as the expectations are set, people feel a sense of then sort of independence in how they respond. Very early on in one of my current workplaces, my supervisor was texting me at nighttime. I was trying to put my kids to bed, and based on experiences before her, it like induced this trigger for me where I felt overwhelmed. I couldn't focus on my kids. This is something I really didn't want to do again. I wanted to have the time to be present. And she quickly said, by the way, these are the expectations, is that you don't respond to me until you're good with it. The next day or within 48 hours, totally fine. If I tell you it's urgent, I still understand that urgency means like, could you get to me at least by the next morning? So all of a sudden, all the expectations were set and I understood. So that when I get the text, my heart doesn't start racing right away. And I have to like get in front of a computer and try to find the information they're looking for. Like that induced a lot of stress. Knowing the expectations, I understand I can finish what I'm doing. And if I'm too tired tonight, I can wait until the morning. Or if I have the energy, I can do it. But yeah, this state of I have to constantly be responding and catching up is also burnout. That's not recovery.
Yeah, that's really important. And I hope people just listen to that and take some action on it because I've been there. I think everybody's been there, right? Like you just said, is you get an email at whatever. For me, it's always like halftime during a Buffalo Bills game, and I think, okay, now I got to respond to this person on a Sunday. But if I don't respond, they're not. I'm not reliable, and they're going to have to go to somebody else. And it takes a couple more seconds to put in the email or the text of, hey, I know it's a weekend. Get back to me by Monday or Tuesday would be perfectly fine. Um,
Yeah. And I think you'll find too, like most people who are even sending those emails out are happy that you're waiting, because if I'm sending you a bunch of emails, I don't want the
that's
response.
like exactly right. Yeah.
Right? I'm just trying to get like my to-do list off. So if there's
Right.
an understanding of like, okay, this thing is on this person's mind, it's great. It's not on my mind right now, so I'll get to it. Yeah, just being really clear with expectation setting is, and that's with everything, by the way. Expectation setting on how you give feedback, on how you communicate, on what your expectation is for hours of work, on what flexibility looks like transparency, expectation is how you can help a team ward off burnout, and then actually modeling that too are like the two biggest things.
Yeah. Well, so I want to get to some of the interventions here in a second, but you mentioned something earlier that I think kind of relates. I brought up the concept of maybe a student studying for an exam, and you had said that it could be burnout because there's this prolonged stress just naturally as a student. But if you have something short term like that, there's kind of that end goal, then there's relief attached to it. So I'm wondering, what are those kind of little rewards, or do those exist, or we have to create those for ourselves? That do those serve as an intervention of, okay, yes, I know this week is going to be stressful because this is going on, but here's the result of that. Here's the positive of that, not just a something that, like you said, we shouldn't be thriving on pain. So making
Yeah.
sure that that reward is actually a beneficial reward, not just something that's satisfying what burnout.
Yeah. Really important question. I have probably 10 different answers to that question because um, I think celebrating oneself is complicated. Yes, you can absolutely, the reward is celebrating this really small things. However, celebration looks very different for people. And I'll give you a good example. Yesterday I was coaching a client. Her inner self-talk is very harsh, right? If she falls short, it's quite a mean tone. And so we're working on how you reward the small things of even catching sort of the judge in her head, right? So you're catching the saboteur. How do you like take the small celebrations of that? And we've tried different things that haven't worked for her. So she tried clapping for herself, super uncomfortable. She was like, I can't do it. It's so stupid. I'm like, okay, great. Wait, you have to find what works for you. So because she's sort of like a check off the to-do list person, it's just a mental like check, did it, right? Celebration. So it's one of those. Yes, you have to find the reward, find the celebration for yourself. And that can feel uncomfortable because most people aren't doing that. But yeah, you want to find the small reward system for people who like to get out of their own way a little bit. Sometimes like a quick dance or like a vocal release, or yeah, a check up the list, or like a bam, got it. Anything that like makes you break this like intensity that's not helping is the little celebrations.
I'm not recording a podcast of viral TikTok dances for your reward reset, but I like
No.
that. It could be, it could be like for me, sometimes it's just putting on, maybe this is more the intervention and the 30-second reset, but putting on like a song for 30
Yes.
seconds, just something to break away from whatever else is going on, and kind of be in the moment a little bit.
Yeah. What's your walk up song?
Well, see, it just depends. I got 10 different answers to that question. We
Okay.
actually, so our team did a really cool job of putting together a meeting a few months ago, and the theme was "We Are WZ." So it was this kind of family theme um, of independently, who are you? Kind of the red circle, green thing you did, but more, what is your role? What do you bring to what is your task at the organization? But then, what do you like to do? And part of it was, what is your walk up song? And the team and everybody submit a song that wasn't necessary. It didn't have to be like an amped up. So I'm qualifying this. It doesn't have to be like running out of the tunnel at the Super Bowl halftime song kind of thing. This was more just your theme song. And I had to go with Frank Sinatra, "My Way," which
Oh,
like you're not going to run out and go like win a boxing match with that one, but maybe. But that's my go-to if I just need like that moment of reset is put a little
Yeah.
Frank or Rat Pack on, and that's going to handle.
Yes, I love that because it kind of like brings out your inner soul, which is, that inner childlike soul is really the goal when you're celebrating. And that looks very different for everybody. And sometimes you have to find the right song, right, for the right moment.
Right.
And that can be. I will say one super short story. I got the opportunity to have a walk up song to the first virtual training I ever did in COVID, and it was to hundreds and hundreds of states attorneys in Chicago, and we were going to talk about burnout and compassion fatigue, and I was so excited that he said, pick a song that resonated with you when you were a kid, and I was like, oh my God, like something you bring out your authentic self. So I picked a song I hadn't listened to in probably 15 years. So did not realize the undertone of of gender and race. And I picked, only my West Coasters are going to know this. And I picked a song called Feelin' Myself by Mac Dre. And it was so offensive. And I was like, oh my God. So now I never, but it broke the ice and everybody was so funny and they were chatting and it still sort of like brought my authentic self. But now I stick with Walking on Sunshine and it just brings a little bit of a lighter mood.
That's much safer. I've had
Yeah.
a couple, the walk up song is fun. And as we're kind of talking about this reset, I've had a few clients that have asked for the same. And I don't ever pick. I let some of the team at the office enjoys picking what foolish song I have to walk up to. But I have learned the trick is when you have a walk up song, be as close to the stage or as far from the stage as possible. Because when you get on the stage and it's still playing for 30 seconds, there's an expectation of rhythm. But if you can
Oh
kill
my
the
God, that's
time
so
by
funny.
walking, it's much easier. So that's my advice to you non-dancers out there.
That's
But
a
what are,
really good piece of advice,
Oh my God.
actually.
I've learned that I've learned that by watching other people get on the stage too quick and then there's 30 seconds of the song. They don't know what to do. They got to start gyrating somehow and it's never really a win. So, but
Oh,
good for
I
them.
love awkward moments. Yeah.
What are some, so okay, so we got music, we've got the clapping, we got all this kind of, what are some other, I like this concept of, vacations always sound good, right? I burn out, I need time off, I need time away, but it might be simpler than that. So what are some more kind of these 30-second resets, interventions? What do those look like?
Yeah. So we want interventions that activate the parasympathetic nervous system. And so when this is done in the right context, so like after a stressful meeting or right before a meeting or after a stressful work project, they break the loop of chronic stress in real time. Okay? So that's the goal. A vacation absolutely helps, but daily regulation is more powerful over time. So I'll tell you my three favorite interventions. The first is somewhere between a 10 to 30 second breath work. None of these interventions, by the way, have to be done a very specific way. There's no perfection to intervention. It's just being intentional about them. So let's say before big meetings, you want to anchor it around things you do often. And at some point, when you get into part 2 of burnout, you can start to kind of write out a day of what it would look like to have intervention throughout because in theory, you want to live through intervention, like through mindfulness versus necessarily like thinking about it so much and adding it. It ends up being second nature. But 30-second breath work interrupts and puts you in a parasympathetic nervous system state. So before I came on this recording with you, I shut my eyes. And although you really don't have to shut your eyes, by the way, you can do breath work in meetings, looking at people awkwardly, and focusing on them. But just big, deep breaths like belly, rib cage, chest, right? Just like a actually does it because it's sending signals to your brain. So even though that might feel strange or out of body, you are sending signals to your brain. It's scientific. It's already been proven. So, have faith in that, if nothing else. But think about if you do your breath before and after every email, and at the end of the day, you've done maybe 20 micro resets. That's huge. So breath work is a big one. And I used to use it a lot during meetings that were tense. And I would use breath work to just sort of keep myself calm, because what it also does is sort of activate this focused clarity state. And I would need to be in that space if I was going to respond in a stress state. So breath work is number one. You also have it, you have breath no matter what, right? It's part of your own body. So you can use it all the time. My suggestion for these interventions, by the way, would be to start to utilize them when you don't need them, right? So you're not like in a stress state or in a crisis state. Now, if you're already there, that's fine. Just keep doing it. But I remember learning breath work through teaching it. We were co-facilitating for the police, and my partner was teaching tactical breath work. And I would sit there and realize I could not take a deep breath because I was already in a state of overwhelm. But because we did this training multiple times a week, I finally was able to take deeper breaths. So you can do it even if you're in a stress response. So that's number one. The second one I would say is a really good intervention is progressive muscle relaxation. Again, you can do this anywhere because not everybody sees when you're tensing. So let's say you're in a meeting and you need some like body signal to reset in your brain. You can squeeze your feet really, really tight and hold, and then just kind of like take a deep breath and release. You can do that then with your lower half. You can do it with your fists. When I'm coaching clients, before we even get into content, we do progressive muscle relaxation because people hold their jaw, they hold their shoulders, and progressive muscle, it sends signals to your body to release, which actually releases then the stress hormones. So that's number two that I love. And I can also send you these resources in case the listeners want to see them.
Yeah, that'd be great.
The third one, which is my favorite one, is intention setting. So, and these are micro intention settings. Okay. So this is not your New Year's intention of this year, I'm going to make $1 million. Although that sounds amazing. Our brain quickly loses those intentions, but micro intentions are really important. And I'll tell you why. They activate this reticular activating system in your brain. So when you set an intention, your brain actively focuses on information that aligns with that intention and then filters out information that does not align with that intention. So it can be really powerful, and then it makes it more likely that you are going to either focus on those things or act in a specific way. So some of my favorite intentions, if I'm feeling overwhelmed and stressed, before I walk into a meeting, it could be something like, focus on my breath. Focus on my breath and see good in what people are saying, right? So it could be something like that if I'm feeling really judgmental in the moment. It could be before my morning routine with my kids. Sometimes I will set a quick intention of be patient and enjoy breakfast. So something really small. And then I can have sort of a little bit bigger intention. So before I do things like this or like teaching or doing live workshops, sometimes I can get a little bit nervous. And when that happens, your judge starts to come forward, your saboteur, right? Of like, maybe you're going to mess up, maybe you won't be great. My favorite intention for me is end of life perspective. So what I usually do is if this was my last day on earth, and I was never going to get to see Dave again, right? I was never going to see you again. How is it that I would want to show up? And what happens for me is that my most authentic self comes forward, my most natural, not a scripted version of me, not this nervous version of me, just me, because this would potentially be the last time I got to do that. So those are examples of mini intentions. And the more you do them throughout a day, the more your brain gets to reset and focus.
These are fantastic. I jotted some notes down. So if you're listening and driving safely, we'll list a link to contact Kasey and find out more about some of these resources in the show notes. So don't worry about writing all this down. So we'll make sure we have that. That was fantastic. I think as you're talking about the intention setting, I was even picturing, like you said, before I get up on a stage and do a presentation or a keynote or whatever it might be. I love doing it, but there's still a level of nervousness sometimes before you get up there. And if at the end of it, it's okay, what's the one thing I just want to make sure the audience feels at the end of this, or the people will take away from this, and having that intention as like the core, just makes it so much easier. As long as I've accomplished that, I know I'll feel good about it, and it takes away some of that stress. These these 30-second interventions are great. I'm curious about the little bit longer ones where we like I when the weather's nice, it's nice to take a step outside the building you're in and go for a walk or do something in nature. But what's the difference between going for a 30-minute walk between that being recovery or being just distraction and you're just right back in the stressor again? Because I think that's the struggle that I know I've had, and I think people have is, okay, I'm going to go for this walk, or I'm going to go work out, or I'm going to go call my friend for 30 minutes. But am I really recovering, or am I just avoiding the problem that I'm going to be right back into it 30 minutes from now?
Yeah. So this also takes a level of self-awareness, but recovery restores energy and presence, and then distraction sort of numbs discomfort, but still leaves you depleted. So anytime, recovery, again, this is kind of hand on the hot stove, like a quick check-in, because recovery activities feel like nourishing, right? So movement, nature. I mean, I live in a city, so that's nature can be hard to come by, but movement, distractions are like doom scrolling, right? Binging. Even though we love a good like Netflix binge, it's not recovery actually because it's not restoring energy and presence. So it can feel good short term, but still increase fatigue. And so it's important to sort of, think about what brings joy, what brings creativity and presence, because if not, we're living sort of in a reaction state instead of an intention state. And then over time, burnout sort of disconnects us from our values and our relationships. So recovery are things that help for sort of fill you back up. And also, I'm aware too that sometimes you'll have sort of a long week, right? Where you're like, I don't have time to recover. And that's where those micro intentions are really important, or micro resets are really important. But then being really intentional, okay, what is the day that I get to do a little reset, right? So again, perfect example of last night, I didn't want to go to another sports activity for my kids. I was tired and I really needed recovery time. And I knew I needed it. I could feel it in my body. I could feel my emotional reactions were sharp. And but I didn't have a choice. I was the only one that could take them. And so I went. And instead of staying in that space and keeping my hand on the hot stove, I chose to enjoy the park. So I ran like a small child and my back hurts from it with my kid. And we played catch and we played tag, which was very silly. And I made the most out of that recovery. So you kind of have to be intentional about what the recovery looks like too. Although that wasn't going to be my ideal state of recovery, I still made it space for that. So I think it's making sure you're connected to it in a space that gives good emotion, versus if I was doing that and the whole time I was thinking to myself, this sucks, I don't want to be here, it wouldn't be recovery.
Right. I'm
So
hearing
two have to work together.
a common theme of intentionality through all of this. Definitely.
Yes.
You mentioned in the beginning, and before we get to kind of some of our final takeaways, you mentioned this concept of identity burnout. And that might be kind of the culmination of this. It seemed like that, but maybe not. But what does that mean? What does that look
Yeah, I think, burnout, I think sometimes can feel the hardest to talk about for people who seem like they need to be strong, right? Because their identity is built around being dependable, capable, unshakable. And so admitting burnout can feel like failure. And this is the sort of the big shift we need to make, but it doesn't start necessarily with like a culture shift. It starts with an individual, and then there's a sort of this ripple effect, right? If it starts with one person and they talk about burnout without sort of feeling like it's a failure thing, and then the next person feels like they can do it, and then the next person feels, right? And all of a sudden you've sort of had this ripple effect of change. But strength without self-awareness can lead to collapse, right? Vulnerability is often the beginning of real resilience. So understanding that burnout is not a failure or a weakness, but it is actual data that your body is giving you to tell you, I need more recovery time, right? I cannot run on empty. If I run on empty, I am not as smart as I could be, as clear as I could be, as active as I could be. And so give me the space to recharge, and then I can be the strongest person, right? So we sort of get in this cycle of like strength pushing, and we're actually getting in our own way.
We're just avoiding the
Right.
problem, right?
Right. And running on empty.
So if for people listening, and so many great takeaways today on how to try to intervene to really simplify it, what can I do at the end of every day, every week, whatever it is, to just have like a benchmark with myself to say, am I trending towards burnout? Like, what's that question I can ask myself, or what are those indicators I should be aware of?
Yeah, I think it's a quick energy check-in. And again, if you want to kind of not to make it too like you're trying to do too many things with yourself, if you want to stay with the hot stove concept of like, what are the things today that I kept my hand on the hot stove for versus what are the things that really energize me? Or you can do a quick energy check-in of what are the things that depleted me today versus what are the things that energized. Sometimes just starting to build that small self-awareness makes such a big difference because you start to catch it then in real time and shift, right? And your mindset, your shift, your intention is everything, right? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The way that your mindset, your intentionality are the things that then come to fruition. And so what you're focused on is important, but that becomes, again, like I said 1,000 times, intention. So I would do an energy check-in at the end of the day and just start to think a little bit about how can I lean into the things that energize me more. In my, a fun activity to do with your team too, and something we do with our coaching clients is an energy optimization sort of activity where you kind of think about what are the things that were low impact, low energy, low impact, high energy, high impact, high energy, high impact, low energy, right? And you start to realize what are the things that fill you up and are the things that really drain you. Can they be moved? Are they necessary? Do other people love them, right? And you start to realize that everybody can work together in a united way. Not everybody's focused or energized on the same thing. So energy check-ins, that red, yellow, green is a great place to start too for just understanding self-awareness.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And then it kind of translates into my last question is, so that was a lot of self-awareness for the leaders, supervisors, mentors that are listening. What's one thing they can maybe start to implement tomorrow to just help the relationship with their team as it relates to burnout?
Yeah, I think, giving your team permission to talk openly about resets, to talk openly about boundaries, you modeling micro recovery. When leaders normalize, a state of constant stress or burnout, or they normalize breaks and reflection, it gives their team permission to do the same. I know sometimes it doesn't feel like we need permission to take care of ourselves, but we do. And sometimes just having the leader give us the permission, right? Like permission granted. You can take resets, you can do recovery, you can model great communication. It gives people a sense of autonomy and then moving forward with self-care.
That's great. So many practical takeaways today. So again, I highly recommend people connect with Kasey on LinkedIn. We'll put your profile link and a little of your professional profile in our show notes so people can learn more. And we only touched on one area of things that you focus on. So everything from, again, mental health awareness in the workplace wellness, leadership development. I know you're doing a lot of work, again, across the spectrum with our law enforcement and public sector folks, corporate work, and then in the education space, which is really interesting, a whole nother topic of what you've done in the education space, which is really cool. So I just appreciate you coming on, but I want to give you this space if there's maybe one last message or one last thing you just want to make sure people walk away with from our conversation today.
Yeah, I think if I were to say one last thing, just remembering that burnout is not a weakness. It's really your nervous system calling for a new way of being, and one that's truly rooted in clarity, rest, alignment, and energy. And so giving yourself the permission to know that that's actually a really good thing, that your body's actually telling you what it needs, is amazing, and always here to be helpful or be supportive. So thank you so much.
No, I love this. So anybody that I interact with routinely, if I start breathing heavy, squeezing my muscles and dancing, just know that those are my resets and my rewards for myself. It doesn't mean I need the 911 call on me. But
way to model it, Dave.
Yes,
way to model it.
No, this is fantastic, helpful. I know a lot of people, especially people who listen to podcasts like this, because a lot of them are so focused on self-development and self-awareness that sometimes there's a blend between burnout and ambition, like we talked about. So I think
Yeah.
this is a good differentiator, and hopefully people leave with intention. So thank you for all the insight, and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
Awesome. And thank you all for listening to this episode of Truth Be Told. To help more listeners find our show, please provide us a rating, give us a follow, and share this episode with your colleagues. For the latest news and to engage with our guests, follow Truth Be Told on your favorite social media apps. And don't forget, we are available on all major platforms, including Apple, Spotify, and watch a video of this episode on YouTube. On behalf of our guests and valued sponsors, thanks again for listening to this episode of Truth Be Told.